to this opportunity, this purposeful event. This event is coordinated by the Tompkins County Health Department to provide education around the COVID-19 vaccine. My name is Pastor Terrence King. I am the pastor of St. James A.M.E. Zion Church here in Ithaca, New York. I am recently planted here as about 10 months or so, and I've been warmly welcomed by all the panelists as well as the Ithaca community. I do want to stress the importance of this Q&A and informational session, as it's important for us to understand what is before us and how it affects us in the interim with this pandemic. Myself personally, I took the vaccine, the first shot of the vaccine, last weekend at the old Sears building in the mall here in Ithaca. The experience was really good for me. I was in and out in 30 minutes. After my appointment was made, I was allotted to register with a nurse there, and they did have a section once you come in that if you have any pre-existing conditions, that you could speak with a doctor before you go in line to get the shot, just to make sure that any other clarifying questions you may have about the shot, the implications of it, they'll answer those questions before you continue. After you wait for your number, per se, your row to be called on, then you're giving one of 16 screened areas in which there will be a nurse and or someone to register you with the county as to your insurance, if you have it or if you don't. The nurse was very friendly, very amicable, answered any all questions. He made sure that before he continued that all my questions were asked. After the shot was given, they had a designated area where you are to sit for 15 to 30 minutes, depending on your medical history. And the purpose for that area was for them to make sure that there were no adverse reactions to the shot. And if you did have an adverse reaction, they just simply asked that you raise your hand, and they would address you accordingly. So after my 15 minutes, I was cleared to go and leave the building. And the funny thing about it is that as I left the building, there were a few college students behind me who were just enthused and excited at the fact that they took the shot together and that they were able to make it over this season of this pandemic. So I do just wanted to share that with you all as a personal note. Again, I greet you here, and I hope that something that is said here allows you to be more knowledgeable as to how this pandemic pans out, as well as what we have offered through the wonderful world of science. Our panelists today, our great panelists today will be J.R. Claiborne. He is the Director of Veteran Services for Tompkins County. We also have Dr. Clarke, who is the Director of the Office of Human Rights for Tompkins County. We have Reverend Wright, a pastor of Calvary Baptist Church. And we have Pastor Benson, a pastor of Baptized Church of Jesus Christ. And we have Dr. Dykes, who is at Upstate Medical Center at Syracuse, New York. And at this time, we're going to release this next stage into the hands of the capable hands of Brother J.R. for the Health Department and updates. Brother J.R.
All right, good evening, everybody. Yes, I'm J.R. Claiborne, the Director for Tompkins County Department of Veteran Services. And it's definitely my pleasure to be amongst this group of esteemed gentlemen. And I get to act like I know something sitting around these folks here. But my part is just to remind folks to let you know that you can find any questions about the vaccines distribution through the Health Department's website. And you can also call our wonderful partners at 211 with additional questions. And if you haven't heard about it, Tompkins County has just launched a vaccination registration page, and you can register for vaccine alerts either through the Swift 911, which is you can call, text, or email through the Health Department's vaccine information listserv. You can also, Shannon has put links, there you go, in the chat box so everyone can see and copy that information there. If you are eligible currently to receive the vaccine, but have not been able to get an appointment, you can now sign up for the newly launched vaccine registry on the Health Department's website. This will allow you to get notified when local appointments are available, either over the phone or through the mail, which can save you a lot of frustration. Friends and family members can sign up other people who have the technology or have internet issues, or you can also call 211 for assistance. All right, now I'd like to turn it over to Reverend Wright and Dr. Clarke. and they will guide us into this evening's discussion.
Okay, thank you so much, JR. And I want to begin our conversation with Dr. Dykes and ask him to tell us a little bit about his background, if you would, Dr. Dykes, and tell us why it is important for you to be part of this conversation tonight.
Sure, thank you, Reverend Clarke. So I'm a physician in Syracuse, New York. I work at Upstate Medical University, where I am on the faculty here in the Department of Orthopedic Surgery. I also have background training, a PhD, in fact, in molecular biology. And so that is the field of science that studies RNA and DNA and so many of the things that you'll hear us talk about when we talk about the coronavirus and the vaccines that we use for this. So here at Upstate Medical University, I devote most of my time to taking care of patients, many of whom have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic over the past year. I also serve as Upstate Medical University's Chief Diversity Officer. And so in this role, it's my responsibility and my privilege to do what we can do as an institution to make sure that there is equity and belonging and inclusion in the things that we do. And as you all know, there's been a considerable disparity in healthcare in general, even before the COVID-19 pandemic. But if nothing else, this pandemic has pointed out to us the tremendous impact and the depth and breadth of the disparity that Black and Brown people receive in healthcare, including what has happened in this pandemic. And hopefully we have an opportunity tonight to educate the listeners to make sure that one more insult to our community is not lack of vaccination and lack of vaccine acceptance.
And thank you so much for your answer. And certainly we know that, circumstances such as a pandemic, as well as other natural disasters, we could think of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, exposed various inequities. And in particular, we've had a lot of discussion, public discussion about the social determinants of health that render people vulnerable to phenomena such as this virus. One of the things I'd like to ask you in relation to this is to describe the science or the research behind the vaccine. Some have questions about that, which have led to questions such as, was this vaccine made too quickly? But maybe if you could talk about what's behind the vaccine in terms of science and research.
Sure. So there are two really important things to consider here. Number one is just the basic fundamental science that goes behind vaccination in general. And then the other, as you alluded to, is this particular circumstance where we have a vaccine that has been developed and tested and come to market and in fact distributed, put into the arms of people in record time. And one of the things that I'll tell you first of all is the technology. So the science behind building the COVID-19 vaccine is very well established and old science. This is science and technology that we've been using for actually decades to build vaccines, to test vaccines, and to approve vaccines once they become available. So there's nothing new about it. The new issue here is that because of the severity of this pandemic and the impact of this pandemic in terms of loss of life, economic impact, its impact on our way of life, there has been a all hands on deck approach to solving this. And so one of the analogies that I often use with my own patients who ask this question is think about, any of us have had the experience, for instance, where we've moved. You've moved from one apartment to another, or you move from an apartment to a home, or from dorm room to dorm room in college. And imagine a scenario where you had all of your belongings, you've got a sofa and a refrigerator and 100 boxes to move. If it's just you and one friend who are doing that move, we all remember how onerous that is and how difficult that process is. But imagine, on the other hand, you have a moving party where you invite 50 of your best friends, and you've got the same sofa and the same refrigerator and the same number of boxes. Well, of course, with 50 people focusing their attention on that move, that gets done much faster, much more efficiently, and with much less difficulty for anyone. And so that analogy explains exactly what has happened in the development of the COVID vaccine. There have been no steps that have been missed. There have been no shortcuts taken. Every single one of the processes has been done exactly as it would have been under the best science available. The difference is we have had all hands on deck and recruited all of the resources of our national pharmaceutical companies, of the National Institutes of Health, of science laboratories, and the Food and Drug Administration to basically drop everything else they were doing, or just about everything else they were doing, to focus on this one particular pressing problem.
Okay, great, thank you. There are questions floating out in the public, such as, will this vaccine give me COVID? Will it make me sick? How do you address those questions?
I think the simplest way to address it is to just dispel flat out those myths. There is absolutely no way that taking this virus can cause disease in a patient who gets the vaccine. So what we have to understand about this, and this gets a little bit technical, it gets a little bit confusing, but we've all heard about the 3 vaccines that are now available in the United States. So there's the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that was the most recently approved. Prior to that, we had the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. Now, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are what we call mRNA vaccines. That stands for messenger RNA. And without getting too technical about it, what RNA is just a simple message that we have in our bodies that tells our bodies to start producing a certain protein, making a certain substance. And so every single day, the DNA in our body, or so the master plan for our cells, actually makes little copies called RNA, messenger RNA. And it's that messenger RNA that our cells read, like you would read a blueprint for a building, to make particular proteins. And so in the case of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, what scientists have done is they've taken that small bit of information that makes the protein that's called a spike protein on the surface of the coronavirus. And so we've all seen pictures of the COVID virus, and it's this spherical structure with these little spikes that stick off. That spike protein on the surface of the virus is what helps it attach to cells and get into the cells to start replicating. So by making an RNA vaccine and injecting that into humans, what our bodies do is start making copies of this spike protein, not the whole virus, just the spike protein. And by those copies propagating from our cells, our bodies recognize those as foreign objects, and then we build antibodies against that foreign spike protein that allows us to stand ready. We've got an army of antibodies and cells primed and ready to fight the COVID virus if we ever become exposed to it. So the short answer to your question is you cannot get COVID infection from a COVID vaccine because they're not injecting the virus into you.
Okay.
And that is the same. Now, it's a little bit different with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is called an adenovirus vaccine. And that vaccine is very, very similar to many of the other vaccines that we've used for decades where they take a deactivated, so basically a non-functional virus, and they're able to insert the necessary information into that virus to make, again, antibodies against the coronavirus in this case. But in no case, in no vaccine, is anyone ever given the COVID virus as part of that process.
Okay. Okay. Great to know. Another question that has emerged: if a person has had COVID already and recovered, do they still need to get vaccinated?
Yes, they do. So one of the things that we understand, and we've understood this before COVID, every single time that your body gets confronted with a foreign invader, our bodies actually get better and better and better at recognizing that foreign invader and fighting it if we're ever exposed to it again. So there's some reason to believe that people who have had COVID virus, who have had the illness, they already naturally build up some immunity to COVID. We just don't know how strong that is or how long it lasts. So by taking the vaccine in addition to that, all of the science suggests that these people might even actually have a better immune response against COVID and may in fact even be better infected than if they had not had it. Now, the one caveat is right now, according to the science that we have, if you have active COVID infection, if you test positive for COVID virus, not have the vaccine, or you don't need the vaccine within 90 days of that infection. We know that at least 90 days of good protection comes by having had exposure to the virus naturally.
Okay. How concerned should we be about side effects of the vaccine, especially if we have a history or experience of underlying conditions?
So that's a great question. And, at this point, we've completed clinical trials before these vaccines were approved. And we've also had now real life use of the vaccines in over 50 million people here in the United States. And what we know from these data is that side effects or serious side effects of the vaccine have been very, very few and far between. One of the earliest recognized side effects was an allergic reaction that some people might have just to getting a vaccine in general. And this doesn't have anything to do with the vaccine itself. It's more likely related to just the inactive ingredients that are in the fluid that help preserve and stabilize the virus during its storage and transportation. Or the vaccine, I'm sorry, during its storage and transportation. And so, as Pastor King mentioned, because of this possibility of an allergic reaction or something like that, we do administer the vaccine and monitor folks for 15 minutes or so, which is the greatest likelihood of time during which they might develop side effects. Now, on the other side of the coin, it is common for people to have minor side effects related to the vaccine itself. And we've heard about, some soreness at the injection site. We've heard about flu-like symptoms. You could be fatigued, you might have pain, you might have lethargy, those kinds of things. That is not, and this is very important to understand, that is not due to the vaccine. It is not the vaccine that are causing those symptoms. Those symptoms come from our body's response to the vaccine, right? And so when we're exposed to the vaccine, our bodies do exactly what they're supposed to do. They go into this heightened mode of readiness to fight. And that process is called inflammation. And so because of the inflammation that can happen around the time of the vaccine, many people will experience some of these symptoms. But again, that is not because you're ill from the vaccine. That is your body's response to gearing up to fight this virus if you're ever exposed to it again. And we know specifically that even it's the second dose of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines that have been most likely to cause some of these reactions. After the vaccine, people will report that they feel tired, or sometimes even, have more severe cold-like, flu-like symptoms. They typically last for 24 hours to 36 hours, and then they dissipate. But again, if that happens to you with the vaccine, you do not need to worry that you have COVID or that you've been infected because of the vaccine. Again, that's a natural, normal response that your body is doing.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. And at this juncture, I'm going to hand off to my colleague and friend, Pastor Wright, to moderate the second half of this conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Clarke. Really appreciate it. Dr. Dykes, thank you always for your time and answers so far. We are thankful also for the participation that is happening within the Q&A portion. I just want to let you know that we're working those in, as well as there'll be a portion towards the end where you'll be able to ask questions live. But we'll continue on, Dr. Dykes. So specifically for people of color, is there a particular vaccine that we should get? Is there one that works best of the three that are currently available in the United States?
So the answer to that question is no. And I will tell you emphatically, if you have, when your turn comes and you have the ability to take a vaccine, please don't pass up that opportunity. Take whichever vaccine is available to you at the time. These vaccines all have demonstrated very, very good results, very good efficacy is what we call it, in preventing severe disease, hospitalization, and death. And what I ask you all to not do is read too far into some of the purported science that you hear, or myths that you hear that one vaccine might be more effective than the other. And when you look at these reports are not really all the time comparing apples to apples. They're comparing apples to oranges sometimes, and you can't really take that too literally, right? All three of these vaccines have very good efficacy against hospitalization, severe disease, needing to be on a respirator, and dying. So I would not do that. Now, with that, what I will say, clearly there are some advantages, some potential advantages to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is a one-dose vaccine. And it also appears to have less stringent storage and transportation requirements. So if you have a population of people, for instance, who are very remote or homebound or difficult to get around, there may be certain circumstances where a one-dose vaccine would be more appropriate for that population of people, as opposed to a two-dose vaccine where there are more logistical challenges about getting the vaccine to them, 3 weeks apart or that sort of thing. But in terms of safety and efficacy, please do not let that go into your decision-making about if you get a vaccine, and then if so, which one.
That is very good to know. That is very good to know. So for those who kind of monitor whatever news station that we consume to get our coronavirus updates, we've heard a lot about variants, right? These variants that are emerging. So how long do scientists expect the vaccine to be effective, given all the uptick and of variant cases that are emerging?
Sure, that's a really great question. And what I'm going to tell you just, right out of the chute is that we don't know. I mean, it's being studied intensely on an ongoing basis. What we do know is that of the variants that have shown up so far, that have emerged, at least the ones that have been most commonly detected in the United States, all three of the available vaccines are effective against the variants that we are seeing. And I just want to say one thing about this whole idea of variants. Viruses always, this is nothing new about COVID. Viruses always mutate. In fact, that's what they do best. That's what they are designed to do. So viruses replicate, we become infected with a virus, it gets in our bodies, and as that virus copies itself and makes more and more copies of itself within us, sometimes there are little mistakes in how the RNA or DNA is copied into the new version of the virus. And when those little mistakes happen, sometimes that new virus actually has properties that are different from the one from which it came. And so this replication and variant process is natural in all replication of cells and viruses that we have. And so what we need to be prepared for, to answer your question most directly, is the very real possibility that we could have variants of COVID that will not be treated, by the vaccines that we have, or not be prevented by the vaccines. So one easy way to understand this, we've all become very familiar with the fact that every single year we get an influenza vaccine, right? You get your flu shot every year because from season to season, there are different variations of the flu vaccine that will become more prevalent in the community. And so we assemble these vaccines. The one shot that you get every year is designed to be effective against the most common variants that are around this particular season. And scientists track this very closely. It is probably expected, it's almost certain, that COVID-19 virus has become endemic in our environment. Basically, it's here. It will probably never go away. It'll probably never be fully eradicated. What we will learn is how to live with this virus without all of the negative effects, without severe infection, without death, and so forth. And I don't know, I don't have a crystal ball, but what I predict is a scenario where we may have to, with some frequency, I don't know if it's once a year or once every 5 years or 10 years, we may need additional vaccines against variants of the COVID-19 virus, just like we need additional vaccines against variants of the flu virus. But that's nothing to be afraid about, to not expect. That's just the nature of the science.
Certainly. So you mentioned that the Moderna and the Pfizer were mRNA vaccines. So part of the reason these questions are so good, I wish I could take credit for them. This is an amazing participation. So keep those coming. What can you please explain why, after, if the technology is old, why after so many decades of not being able to use mRNA vaccines, they should be trusted now, especially given the historical adverse reactions?
Yeah, there really haven't been a lot of historical adverse reactions to mRNA vaccines. I think what's happened, conversely, is, again, this is cutting edge technology. And it has taken all of the resources, as I was mentioning earlier, to finally cross these final T's, dot the final I's, in order to get this technology to the point where it could be used on a large scale, right? So we have been doing RNA replication and making RNA vaccines, again, for decades. This technology, actually a lot of this technology, in terms of understanding these viruses, understanding how they replicate, and understanding how we might create vaccines about them, started in its most important forms back during the peak of the HIV infection, pandemic. And, we all know that, 30 years ago or so, we were dealing with a major worldwide crisis in terms of HIV infection and how that was proliferating through the world. And so this research on virology and vaccination started in earnest during HIV research and has just gotten better and better over time. And the way to think about this, rather than being skeptical, is to be grateful, is to be thankful that we do have this long track record of scientific innovation that now makes this possible.
So, and that's kind of on the science side of it. On the social side, how can we and why should we trust that the vaccine is safe? Kind of along the lines of, how do we know, in this people of color form, right, that this isn't just a modern version of a Tuskegee syphilis study, right? How do we know that can you kind of speak to the social implications of all of this vaccine?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are certain populations of people, particularly Black Americans, who have every right to be skeptical of science and of medicine and of healthcare and of research around science. Not only because of those instances that you cite, like the Tuskegee experience, but as we just alluded to earlier, even before COVID was an issue, we know with no doubt that Black and brown people in this country receive disparate healthcare. We die at greater rates of death and disease and suffering, have greater rates of death and disease and suffering due to diabetes and heart disease and stroke and obesity and so many other conditions, that there's good reason to be distrustful of the medical system. But I think the other reality, there are two realities. Number one is much of this research, much of the testing, the vetting of these vaccines has actually been done by African American scientists and doctors. And the testing has included large populations of Black and brown people in the testing cohort that has demonstrated that there is no increased risk to anyone based upon their race or ethnicity, right? So that's one thing. Now, on the other hand, I didn't mention earlier in my introduction, I also worked for a while at the FDA. I worked at a very senior level at the Food and Drug Administration, doing exactly these kinds of things in the division of the FDA, where they study and approve or disapprove drugs and devices that are coming to market. And what I can tell you with no uncertain terms, based upon my own personal experience there, is that the scientists at the Food and Drug Administration are career officials, career scientists who are absolutely dedicated to the science and to the work that they are doing. There is zero chance. There's zero chance that anybody in a White House or in a Congress or in a Department of Health and Human Services could create a conspiracy so big that all of these independent scientists at the Food and Drug Administration and the external panels that they recruited to review these data would falsify this data or would put forth for consumers a vaccine that was not safe and effective. It's just not conceivable.
Right, right. I would simply add, for folks who may have that particular concern, to do some research, to study up on the Tuskegee syphilis study, and to remember that those individuals had syphilis and just weren't given treatment, right? And so it's kind of it is certainly a slightly different bend to it all. So Dr. Dykes, what would you say to someone who calls and says, listen, I'm really worried about the vaccine. There's so many things that just make me nervous about it. Can I just wait for the pandemic to be over?
There are two things that I would say to them. I would say, if you're worried about the vaccine, why don't you come visit me? Not that you really could, but theoretically, why don't you come visit me in a COVID intensive care unit where there are people on ventilators fighting for their breath from the virus? Every single thing that we do in medicine, every decision that I make every single day when I'm talking to my patients about any medical treatment, always weighs the risk against the benefit, right? There is no medical treatment, there's no pill, there's no shot, there's no surgery that is 100% risk-free. But what we do is we look at the benefit of the treatment. What is the condition we're trying to prevent, or what is the disease we're trying to treat, and weigh the burden of that disease or illness against the risk of the treatment that we're talking about. And so I don't want to mislead anyone and tell you that vaccines are completely without risk. That's not true. There is some risk. We already talked about side effects that people have. But the underlying truth is that the downsides, the risks of getting vaccinated, are so much smaller than the risk of getting this infection. And so to answer your question directly, there are a couple of reasons why you should not wait. Number one is it is also a myth that even young, healthy people can't get COVID and can't die from COVID. And even if you don't die, there are things that we are discovering every single day about this virus, and new ways that we're discovering that it can affect people over the long term. We know that it has effects on your heart. It has effects on your lungs. It has effects on your nervous system. And even though young people may get infected with COVID and not have severe disease today, we don't know whether or not 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 30 years from now, the effect that it has on your heart, your lungs, your organs, your brain, your nervous system won't manifest then. And we don't know that it won't create problems for you down the road that we can't yet foresee. And then the third issue is, we do know that people, even when they're asymptomatic and young and healthy, can be asymptomatic carriers. So even if you don't do it for yourself, or you don't have severe disease or death or hospitalization yourself, think about your loved ones. Think about the people you work with. Think about the people in your family. Think about your grandmother, your grandfather, who you could very well unknowingly, and certainly unintentionally, transmit this virus to someone that you care about. So no, please, when your time comes and you get an invitation, you have the ability to take the vaccine, please take the vaccine when you can, and do not have that mindset that, yeah, I'll just do it later. We have no idea what might happen to you between that time and when that later comes.
So kind of a follow-up to that, what do we know about you mentioned some of the lung and heart damage stuff. What else do we know about kind of the long-term effects of not just COVID, but of the vaccines?
So it's a great question, and it's impossible for us to know about long-term effects of something that we have not studied for long terms, right? And there's just really no way around that. We won't know that until we cross that bridge, right? But what we can do is make science-based, fact-based predictions, right? And so when we talk about the vaccine on one hand, we have decades and decades and decades of experience with vaccine. Most of us on this call, I presume all of us on this call, have had vaccines of one type or another, probably many types over the course of our lifetime, right? We have history, we have data that helps us understand how vaccines work, what the downsides of vaccines are over many, many, many decades. And then you couple that with the fact that even in the 1 year, it seems like it's been an eternity. I know we're all, fed up with this, and it is just now turning the corner towards that 1 year point since we first discovered widespread COVID infection in the United States. And even in that one short year, there is no question about it that we have seen what is called, long haulers syndromes, long haulers symptoms, right? And it sounds a little bit strange to talk about a long hauler in the context of, just 10 months or 1 year, but there's no question about it that there are people who have had COVID infection, recovered from the disease. So they get to a point where they test negative. They no longer have COVID, but they still have symptoms, difficulty breathing, shortness of breath, memory loss, changes in their taste, changes in their sensation and smell, these other nervous system manifestations. And the thing that is so important for our community about it is so many of these things interact with other health problems that we have. We have higher rates of asthma, of hypertension, of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, heart disease. We don't need the effects of this virus on our hearts, on our lungs, on our kidneys, when we already suffer disproportionately from these diseases.
So to add just one more layer to that, to those questions. So should immunocompromised individuals be concerned about taking the vaccine, since researchers did not include those individuals in the initial studies?
So there is nothing about the vaccine that will harm an immunocompromised person. If you think about just how the vaccine works and how it produces. Now, if someone is immune compromised for whatever reason, either because of illness or a condition that they have, or even medications that they're on, we know that there are some medications like steroids and so forth that we give to people that turns down, it kind of blunts their immune system. Well, one problem that could happen theoretically is if you're immune compromised and you get the vaccine, we're actually depending on your immune system to start producing the antibodies and the cells to fight the virus. So if you're immune compromised, there may be a less effective response in terms of the antibodies and the cells that you're producing. But on the other side of the coin, you are exactly the person who most needs to be protected.
So
Right?
that's a great point. Yeah. I do have a question that's near and dear to me, because it can help keep my parents in line and my members who have already taken at least one or both of their shots. Once I get the vaccine, can I stop wearing a mask?
No. There's an absolute straight out no. So two issues. Number one, it takes a while after you're fully vaccinated. So in the case of the Pfizer Moderna vaccine, you get 2 doses. It's usually 2 weeks or so after that second dose that you have your maximum protection from the vaccination. So certainly during those 2 weeks after the vaccine, you should not consider yourself fully vaccinated. On the other hand, even if we are fully vaccinated, what we know is that these vaccines are effective against preventing severe disease, hospitalization, and death. It does not mean that you can't be infected with COVID, right? And so that's exactly the wrong thing to do, is to get the vaccine and now think that we can forget about all of the very important basic public health measures that have allowed us to fight this pandemic up to now. And that means wearing a mask. It means physical distancing. It means washing our hands, those kinds of things. And so to tell you exactly, like, let's imagine you do get two doses of the vaccine, and then you stop these basic public health measures. You can be infected with COVID and just not know it because you don't experience any symptoms because you're relatively protected. That does not mean that you can't transmit that virus to other people who have not yet been vaccinated or who are not protected. So wearing the mask, continuing our public health measures is a way that we will continue to tamp down spread of the virus, while we also use this vaccine technology to boost immunity against the virus in our population.
So then, does the vaccine keep me from spreading the virus to others, or just keep me from feeling the effects?
So we don't know exactly. So and basically, if you think about it just from a common sense perspective, there's nothing about a vaccine that could keep you from spreading it to someone else, right? If you have the virus and it's in your system, this virus is spread by respiratory droplets, right? So if you have the virus and you're speaking and there are droplets of fluid that are coming out when you breathe and when you speak, if the virus is in that fluid, well, then of course you could spread it to someone else, even if you're vaccinated. Now, what we also know, however, is that people who are fully vaccinated are, even if they are infected, they're likely to have a much, much lower load of the virus in their system. And so those respiratory droplets that, they are dispelling are less likely to contain the virus. And if they do, they're less likely to contain large quantities of the virus. So therefore, it follows that they would be less likely to transmit the virus. But it doesn't mean that it can't happen.
Thank you so much, and thank you, attendees, for all of your questions. If you do wish to ask, please raise your hand. This is the last call for any questions. You can either type in the Q&A section, or if you raise your hand in the Zoom, we'll be able to unmute you so you can ask it yourself. But seeing none, it is my pleasure to turn it over to Pastor Benson, who will close us out tonight.
Hello, praise the Lord, everyone. What I'm thinking is variables. There are a lot of variables, and so there appears to be a lot of uncertainty. And so if I'm going to pray tonight, I'm going to pray about getting us through the variables and getting us through the uncertainty, because we're still in to me, an area of uncertainty. And to, in turn, calm us down. One thing I found out that we're very edgy. And because we're so edgy, we can do and say things that we shouldn't. And so I'm going to pray and ask God to help us to in turn get through the variables and give us more certainty scientifically on this issue, that we can see ourselves more protected as a society. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for the day. We thank you for Dr. Sykes. We thank you for this panel. And we're honored, oh God, just to give this kind of information out to our general public so that we can be more alerted and more armed to deal with this virus. We're asking you to remember our scientific community, Lord, and we're asking for a greater sense of certainty, my God. And so you'll have to give this wisdom, because the wisdom that we're asking for is coming from God. So bless today our dear doctor in his duties as a doctor in this particular area. Remember our panel, Dr. Wright, and remember Dr. the preacher here from St. James, and remember Dr. Clarke. Remember those, and Brother JR today, and those who are so concerned and vitally concerned about our community. And so we're asking you to help us, my God, because protection comes from you, and you know how to protect us from dangers that we don't even see. So I'm asking you for the kind of wisdom that's needed to settle this issue in our world and in our society, because you know how to settle issues as you did for the polio vaccine. Oh, that polio vaccine came when I was a youngster, and it settled some issues in our world and in our society. And so we're asking you to give us the kind of help that will settle the issues, and that this virus will not be a threat to the world and to our society. And this I thank you for, in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Want to just say thank you to Shannon and Deanna and the county folks who helped put all of this together. I'm so grateful for your inclusion, and I'm thankful for this great panel who continues to work hard to build community. And thank you again, Dr. Dykes, for taking time out to share with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.